Hello, class. Welcome to the new unit, which is American Empire. You can see in this image that you've got kind of an example in the form of a watercolor painting of American imperialism. We're going to define what imperialism is, but just to kind of introduce the topic, you can see the US is trying to do what's called project power in this image. Um, Quite literally, you have the ships in this image kind of going towards the viewer of them, and you got these American flags on top. And this is a fleet called the Great White Fleet, which is basically the first modern navy, similar to what we have nowadays, of the United States. It was sent on a journey throughout the world, basically to intimidate the US's neighbors into opening their markets for them and or becoming colonies of the United States. Imperialism is a broad concept, and so you can make arguments, and you'll see once we look at the definitions of imperialism how broad the concept is. But in this unit, we're focusing on the period in the United States between 1890 and 1917, where the United States itself, or Americans themselves, called the United States an empire. You, at this point, have read through the play, and this quote here from John Stevens, the U.S. Minister to Hawaii, states that the Hawaiian pear is now fully ripe, and this is the golden hour for the United States to pluck it. So, what you're looking at in this image is what's called a plantation, which you may remember from learning about slavery in the United States. And it's not strictly speaking slave grown crops, but it's monoculture, meaning one type of crop. This is just a field for miles full of pineapples. So, one of the things about this period that, again, is unique is the US viewed itself as an empire and would openly talk about itself as an empire, whereas nowadays you would have a very difficult time getting anyone to admit that the US was an imperial nation. You can see the pride the US had in the annexation of the Philippines, which we'll discuss in, I believe it's the next section, and comparing it to the size of Alaska. Down below, this map is titled "The Greater United States," and it basically just shows that the United States is constantly expanding. If you remember the concept of manifest destiny, the God-given right of the U.S. to expand, it starts to look less harmless when you consider that manifest destiny led to the genocide of the Native Americans. And you can see those numbers on that map. 1848, 1803 really doesn't say the full story that we looked at in our westward expansion unit. And similarly with the Philippine Islands, that was in 1898. Those islands were annexed without their permission. And again, with doing things by force is a sign that you are an empire. So the focus question for this this section is how and why did the United States become an empire in the late 19th century, and what does this mean? So, three characteristics of empire. Empires are extractive economies, meaning they take resources from one area, take them from that area without leaving, an infrastructure to support that community. Once the resource is done, that investment in that area is done, and give the center of the country an edge in the kind of global competition for material resources. Colonies, what these are, again, this is you got a mother country or a center of the country, and then an outlying area that's used for these purposes. You could have a colony to acquire markets to basically sell American, or in the case of other empires, their goods. So a good example of this would be, the city of Hong Kong, and Great Britain had this as a colony, and it was exclusively in order to literally force, which they did with the help of the United States and other European nations, the Chinese to buy Western goods. The third kind of characteristic of empire is basically the idea that might makes right, and we define that as militarism, the idea that military force should be a center of the country's power in a way that it projects power. We've already discussed what nationalism is, but the idea, militarism serves nationalism by encouraging a view that basically the strength of the military is a sign of the strength of the country itself. You can see, as far as the U.S. specifically is concerned, the beginning of the idea of empire, the idea that force is the thing that justifies basically what the United States is doing with the Monroe Doctrine back in 1823, where the U.S. basically said to all other countries in the world, the Western Hemisphere is ours because we're strong enough to say so, even though they actually weren't. And everyone else should stay out because, again, we have that military strength and we are going to use this area for our markets and to get resources to make ourselves richer. The island of Hawaii, this is just kind of a image that shows you how it got populated, just to kind of rewind back to that. And so it's important to remember that empire is not, strictly speaking, a Western European and American thing. This is the expansion of the Polynesian Empire up to the year 900 AD, when the kings of Hawaii and the queens of Hawaii were finally established in those islands. So there's an important expansion going on, in this case, eastward expansion versus a westward expansion. So there's a concept called social Darwinism. And as you know from your biology classes, Charles Darwin had a scientific theory that of natural selection and survival of the fittest. And just kind of like in its application to the poor in the industrial era, there was an idea that the strong countries were strong because they were more capable, and weaker countries with weaker militaries were weaker because they were less capable and less deserving. So there was a belief in the U.S. if the U.S. was not expanding and colonizing and conquering people, without them giving permission to become a part of the United States, they were going to be consumed, Americans, by the Europeans who are colonizing the world rapidly. It was kind of a really bad example of, oh, those other people are doing it, let me jump off that bridge too. There is a extremely influential book which has a thesis that is 100% accurate. So, great powers rely on great navies. So, Alfred T. Mahan wrote the book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And in that book, he argues that, again, great powers rely on great navies, going all the way back to the Roman Empire. And his book focuses on Great Britain, which had the largest navy in the world and was also the richest country in the world at this time period. The, again, special American twist that kind of gets put onto imperialism in the United States is Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, where he argues that the American democracy, so the things that makes American democracy work, were forged in the American frontier, and therefore the U.S. must constantly expand, or else its democracy would be in danger. So if you think about things like the Homestead Act, land stolen from Native Americans, given for free to individual pioneers, 160 acres. They're allowed to do whatever they please. No, they don't need anyone to help them, and that allows them to be independent and not need a government, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is forcing them to do things. And so, the idea that everyone needs to be rugged individuals, and the fact that there was a society where there was industrial unrest, made people think there would be a safety valve, a release valve, like steam building up in a pipe, if the U.S. just went and got some colonies and conquered some areas. So this is an image of Cecil Rhodes, who is a famous imperialist, probably the most infamous imperialist in world history. And he is showing the telegraph line, the Cape to Cairo telegraph line that Great Britain strung over the continent of Africa, because they had colonies going all the way from Egypt down to South Africa. And again, the U.S. saw this and thought, these giant men standing on top of continents will conquer us if we're not careful. That's a very small joke. Oh, right. Social Darwinism is deeply racist. Did I not mention that already? So you've got a image. I mean, you can see this pretty clearly. This is an image from a high school textbook, biology textbook, arguing that Europeans are ideal human beings, and Africans, and as they refer to in this as Negroes, are closer to chimpanzees. So they've literally got a statue for the European fellow. You've got this grotesque image of a black man, and then there's a monkey right below, because they were trying to justify the conquering of areas like Africa by Europeans. And social Darwinism basically says it's because the Europeans are better, and therefore, and not even just better, but are destined biologically, and because they are superior, which starts, make it very clear how you end up with ideologies like Nazism in the 1930s. It doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from imperialism. So again, imperialism here, manifest destiny, deeply racist ideology. You can see the Native Americans fleeing from the goddess of progress here, who is stringing telegraph wire across the United States. The Transcontinental Railroad moves across the nation. This is another troubling image, but this is Uncle Sam, as you can recognize in the pinstripes, teaching the unruly colonies of the United States, which, again, we're going to get into in the next section. You can see the white children in the back are different U.S. states. So, like Texas here, sitting there quietly reading their book. You've got, and then in the front, you've got the four colonies of the United States who are majority minority, meaning, Hawaiian, Native Hawaiian, Polynesian, African, or in the case of Puerto Rico and Cuba, or Filipino in the case of the Philippines, being sternly reprimanded by this teacher. In the background, you've got a Native American fellow who's got his book upside down, can barely even read, is sitting in the corner in kind of the dunce's stool. There's a black man washing the window because that's apparently the only job he can do. And there's a Chinese lad who isn't even allowed inside of the school. So in the background, you can also see England was governed their colonies whether they consented or not, but not waiting for the consent. She was uh, greatly advanced the world civilization. The United States must uh, basically give its territories the same gift that England gave its ungoverned colonies, which is super ironic if you know anything about American history, where the United States rebelled specifically because it was an ungoverned colony that resented the condensation of its mother country. So, this cartoon kind of sums it up all in a nutshell. First steps towards American empire, as far as international scale is concerned, is when Commodore Matthew Perry of the U.S. Navy sailed his so-called black ships into Edo Harbor in Japan, and fired his guns over the harbor in a country that was still in a sort of medieval technology position because they had deliberately closed themselves off from Europeans, fearing colonization and imperialism, and forced the Japanese to start buying American goods. The ships were called black ships because they were steamships, and the black smoke billowing into the harbor, that basically were described as demons or dragons, etc. Just kind of who are these monsters in our harbor. Um, 1867, a little light imperialism with the purchase of Alaska from Russia for something like 10 cents in modern day money an acre, which has been paid back tremendously with all the gold and the oil from that. And then I think, fascinatingly, the acquisition of Midway Island via the Guano Islands Act occurred that year as well. The same year, very busy year, 1867, was the beginning of the Pan American Conference, where basically all the Latin American countries are put together into a group run by the United States, which still exists, by the way, to effectively promote American and Latin American businesses. So banana plantations and the like in Central America have their roots in this Pan American Conference. This is a Japanese woodcut drawing of the black ships, which, is a fascinating historical artifact. You can see the water wheel, you can see the little tiny men like in the rigging of the ship and the smoke billowing out in a very, not a super accurate rendition of the American flag, but one if you had only seen it once and there were no photographs, you can understand where it would come from. And there's an American soldier, Marine, in the upper left who is forcing the Japanese to interact with the rest of the world against their will. So, my favorite part of this unit is that much of the American Empire started because of islands covered in bird poop. So, what this island is an island entirely covered in guano. And guano is a tremendously, tremendously useful fertilizer, which was super important in the United States because we had just basically destroyed the Native American tribes' resistance, and all of a sudden there was all this farmland and relatively marginal areas to be able to farm. So the U.S. sought out new fertilizer sources, and there was a law passed in 1856 that said any spot of land covered in bird poop in the world without people on it that an American steps on becomes that person's property and part of the United States. This law is still on the books. So if you can find an island somewhere in the world covered in bird poop and you can step on it, you too can be an imperialist and conquer an island full of birds. So again, just the way this connects. Industrial mining makes it so the West, where the Native Americans have had their land stolen, can be successfully farmed. That successful farming increases the U.S. population. That increased U.S. population demands further expansion because there's unrest as people start to not just get 160 acres each and nobody that they have to compete for resources with. And again, think about the robber barons and the captains of industry concept. you have the rich getting richer, and the poor are not seeing the benefits of all of this change in their society. So bird poop islands may not seem important, but they're connected deeply to this whole subject we've been studying. Here's another bird poop island. I think it's hilarious. It's a giant island full of bird poop. And it's worth tons of money and made it so imperialism happened. Here's another one. Those are men literally mining. You can see that donkey down below. That donkey is not as tall as this island full of bird poop. And this is an advertisement for it because this is also, again, the time period where advertisements were invented. So you've got this very bucolic, lovely scene. And again, this scene is possible because of this island full of bird poop. These are all of most of the U.S. tiny islands kind of out in the west of the United States and areas like Guam and American Samoa. Many of them require because of this loss. I'm not trying to overstate its importance. This is the Organization of American States. It's got a sweet logo. It's all the flags of Latin America, Canada, and the United States. So the kind of key thing that you've looked at in this unit is the acquisition of the modern-day U.S. state of Hawaii. And so basically people from New England had made contact with Hawaii since the 1760s. Sailors from places like Nantucket, New Bedford, Fall River, Block Island down in Rhode Island, they would take their Yankee clippers, roll themselves, around South America, and I guess float themselves around South America. And basically, when the winds were blowing the wrong way, they would hang out in a tropical paradise in Hawaii and use that as a place to stay for years and years in some cases. Eventually, missionaries follow. So Protestant missionaries come in, and sugar plantations and the real extractive economy, again, taking those resources out. And the plantations have armed guards, U.S. troops, and that's where the force comes in too. King Kaluikalaui was forced to give white landowners voting rights, which basically is a coup in this government, and it becomes a white man's government as opposed to a Native Hawaiian government. And then his daughter, Queen Liliuokalani, tried to change the constitution of the state, and U.S. Marines were basically sent in to overthrow the government there. And you pay attention to this name, Sanford Dole, and if you don't recognize it, that's the banana company, was placed in charge. So literally the head of a banana and pineapple company was made the first president of the Republic of Hawaii, which is its only act as a government was to be annexed to the United States. Anti-imperialists in the U.S. government, including members of Congress in Massachusetts, were only able to delay the annexation of Hawaii for 5 years, from 1893 to 1898. And here is a lava flow going across a farm field in Hawaii. And this is Hawaii again. It's beautiful. Also, it's bigger than you think it is. There's a lot of Hawaiian islands that go thousands of miles out into the ocean. And that's that. Next section is going to be the Spanish-American War.